Synopsis of the Books of the Bible. Hebrews. By JND Darby. New Testament. Hebrews. Chapter 12. Practical exhortations flowing from doctrinal instruction as to dangers, running the race set before us. Hebrews 12. The epistle now enters on the practical exhortations that flow from its doctrinal instruction, with reference to the dangers peculiar to the Hebrew Christians. Instruction suited throughout to inspire them with courage. Surrounded with a cloud of witnesses like these of Hebrews 11, who all declared the advantages of a life of faith and promises still unfulfilled, they ought to feel themselves impelled to follow their steps, running with patience the race set before them, and above all looking away from every difficulty, see note, to Jesus, who had run the whole career of faith, sustained by the joy that was set before him, and, having reached the goal, had taken his seat in glory at the right hand of God. Note. It is not insensibility to them, but, when they are felt to be there, looking from them to Christ. This is the secret of faith. Be careful, for nothing need not have been said, if nothing had been calculated to awaken care. Abraham considered not his body now dead. End of note. The Lord's example as having run the whole career of faith. This passage presents the Lord, not as he who bestows faith, but as he who has himself run the whole career of faith. Others had travelled a part of the road, had surmounted some difficulties. The obedience and the perseverance of the Lord had been subjected to every trial of which human nature is susceptible. Men, the adversary, the being forsaken of God, everything was against him. His disciples flee when he is in danger. His intimate friend betrays him. He looks for someone to have compassion on him and finds no one. The fathers, of whom we read in the previous chapter, trusted in God and were delivered, but as for Jesus, he was a worm, and no man. His throat was dry with crying. His love for us, his obedience to his Father, surmounted all. He carries off the victory by submission and takes his seat in a glory exalted in proportion to the greatness of his abasement and obedience, the only just reward for having perfectly glorified God where he had been dishonored by sin. The joy and the rewards that are set before us are never the motives of the walk of faith. We know this well with regard to Christ, but it is not the less true in our own case. They are the encouragement of those who walk in it. Jesus, then, who has attained the glory due to him, becomes an example to us in the sufferings through which he passed in attaining it. Therefore we are neither to lose courage nor to grow weary. We have not yet, like him, lost our lives in order to glorify God and to serve him. The way in which the apostle engages them to disentangle themselves from every hindrance, whether sin or difficulty, is remarkable, as though they had nothing to do but to cast them off as useless weights. And in fact, when we look at Jesus, nothing is easier. When we are not looking at him, nothing more impossible. What is to be cast off? The way and power to do it. There are two things to be cast off, every weight, and the sin that would entangle our feet, for he speaks of one who is running in the race. The flesh, the human heart, is occupied with cares and difficulties, and the more we think of them, the more we are burdened by them. It is enticed by the object of its desires. It does not free itself from them. The conflict is with a heart that loves the thing against which we strive. We do not separate ourselves from it in thought. When looking at Jesus, the new man is active. There is a new object, which unburdens and detaches us from every other by means of a new affection which has its place in a new nature, and in Jesus himself, to whom we look, there is a positive power which sets us free. It is by casting it all off in an absolute way that the thing is easy, by looking at that which fills the heart with other things, and occupies it in a different sphere, where a new object and a new nature act upon each other, and in that object there is a positive power which absorbs the heart and shuts out all objects that act merely on the old nature. What is felt to be a weight is easily cast off. Everything is judged of by its bearing on the object we aim at. If I run in a race and all my thought is the prize, a bag of gold is readily cast away. It is a weight. But we must look to Jesus. Only in him can we cast off every hindrance easily and without reservation. We cannot combat sin by the flesh. Trials that must be borne, God's chastisement neither to be despised nor be discouraged by it, its purpose. But there is another class of trials that come from without. They are not to be cast off, they must be borne. Christ, as we have seen, went through them. We have not like him resisted even to the shedding of our blood rather than fail in faithfulness and obedience. Now God acts in these trials as a father. He chastises us. They come perhaps, as in the case of Job, from the enemy, but the hand and the wisdom of God are in them. He chastises those whom he loves. We must therefore neither despise the chastisement nor be discouraged by it. We must not despise it, for he does not chastise without a motive or a cause. Moreover, it is God who does it, nor must we be discouraged, for he does it in love. If we lose our life for the testimony of the Lord and in resisting sin, the warfare is ended, and this is not chastisement, but the glory of suffering with Christ. Death, in this case, is the negation of sin. He who has died is free from sin. He who has suffered in the flesh is done with sin. But up to that point, the flesh in practice, for we have a right to reckon ourselves dead, is not yet destroyed, and God knows how to unite the manifestation of the faithfulness of the new man who suffers for the Lord, with the discipline by which the flesh is mortified. For example, Paul's thorn in the flesh united these two things. It was painful to him in the exercise of his ministry, for it was something that tended to make him contemptible when preaching, and this he endured for the Lord's sake, but at the same time it kept his flesh in check. God's purposes of holiness, the fruits of soul exercise. Verse 9. Now we are subject to our natural parents, who discipline us after their own will. How much more than to the Father of spirits, see note, who makes us partakers of his own holiness. Observe here the grace that is appealed to. We have seen how much the Hebrews needed warning. Their tendency was to fail in the career of faith. The means of preventing this is doubtless not to spare warning, but yet to bring the soul fully into connection with grace. This alone can give strength and courage through confidence in God. Note. Father of spirits is simply in contrast with fathers of our flesh, end of note. We are not come to Mount Sinai, to the law which makes demands on us, but to Zion, where God manifested his power in re-establishing Israel by his grace in the person of the elect king, when, as to the responsibility of the people, all was entirely lost, all relationship with God impossible on that footing, for the ark was lost. There was no longer a mercy seat, no longer a throne of God among the people. Ichabod was written on Israel. Therefore in speaking of holiness he says, God is active in love towards you, even in your very sufferings. It is he who has not only given free access to himself, by the blood and by the presence of Christ in heaven for us, but who is continually occupied with all the details of your life, whose hand is in all your trials, who thinks unceasingly about you, in order to make you partakers of his holiness. This is not to require holiness on our part, necessary as it must ever be. It is in order to make us partakers of his own holiness. What immense and perfect grace! What a means! It is the means by which to enjoy God himself perfectly. Verse 11. God does not expect us to find these exercises of soul pleasant at the moment. They would not produce their effect if they were so, but afterwards, their will being broken they produce the peaceable fruits of righteousness. The pride of man is brought down when he is obliged to submit to that which is contrary to his will. God also takes a larger, ever precious, place in his thoughts and in his life. Grace the motive for the path of faith and godliness. Verse 12. On the principle then of grace, the Hebrews are exhorted to encourage themselves in the path of faith and to watch against the buddings of sin among them, whether in yielding to the desires of the flesh or in giving up Christian privileges for something of the world. They were to walk so courageously that their evident joy and blessing, which is always a distinct testimony and one that triumphs over the enemy, should make the weak feel that it was their own assured portion also, and thus strength and healing would be administered to them instead of discouragement. The path of godliness as to circumstances was to be made easy, a beaten path to weak and lame souls, and they would feel more than stronger souls the comfort and value of such a path. Grace, we have already said, is the motive given for this walk, but grace is here presented in a form that requires to be considered a little in detail. Mount Sinai contrasted with Mount Zion. We have not come, it says, to Mount Sinai. The terrors of the majesty of God kept man at a distance. No one was to approach him. Even Moses feared and trembled at the presence of Jehovah. This is not where the Christian is brought. But, in contrast with such relationships as these with God, the whole millennial state in all its parts is developed, according however to the way in which these different parts are now known as things hoped for. We belong to it all, but evidently, these things are not yet established. Let us name them: Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, the angels and general assembly, the church of the firstborn, whose names are inscribed in heaven, God the judge of all, the spirits of the just made perfect, Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and finally, the blood of sprinkling which speaketh better things than that of Abel. Zion, we have spoken of as a principle. It is the intervention of sovereign grace, in the king, after the ruin, and in the midst of the ruin, of Israel, re-establishing the people according to the counsels of God in glory, and their relationships with God himself. It is the rest of God on the earth, the seat of the Messiah's royal power. But, as we know, the extent of the earth is far from being the limits of the Lord's inheritance. Zion on earth is Jehovah's rest. It is not the city of the living God. The heavenly Jerusalem is that, the heavenly capital, so to speak, of his kingdom, the city that has foundations, whose founder and builder is God himself. The assembly of the firstborn in heaven, their portion, God the judge of all and those owned as his before the heavenly assembly was revealed. Having named Zion below, the author turns naturally to Jerusalem above, but this carries him into heaven, and he finds himself with all the people of God, in the midst of a multitude of angels, the great universal assembly, see note, of the invisible world. There is however one peculiar object on which his eye rests in this marvelous and heavenly scene. It is the assembly of the firstborn whose names are inscribed in heaven. They were not born there, not indigenous like the angels, whom God preserved from falling. They are the objects of the counsels of God. It is not merely that they reach heaven, they are the glorious heirs and firstborn of God, according to his eternal counsels, in accordance with which they are registered in heaven. The assembly composed of the objects of grace, now called in Christ, belongs to heaven by grace. They are not the objects of the promises, who, not having received the fulfillment of the promises on earth, do not fail to enjoy them in heaven. They have the anticipation of no other country or citizenship than heaven. The promises were not addressed to them. They have no place on earth. Heaven is prepared for them by God himself. Their names are inscribed by him. It is the highest place in heaven above the dealings of God in government, promise, and law on the earth. This leads the picture of glory onto God himself. But, having reached the highest point, that which is most excellent in grace, he is seen under another character, namely, as the judge of all, as looking down from on high to judge all that is below. This introduces another class of these blessed inhabitants of the heavenly glory, those whom the righteous judge owned as his before the heavenly assembly was revealed, the spirits of the just arrived at perfection. They had finished their course, they had overcome in conflict, they were waiting only for glory. They had been connected with the dealings of God on the earth, but, faithful before the time for its blessing was come, they had their rest and their portion in heaven. Note: the word here translated assembly was that of all the states of Greece, that of the firstborn is the word for the assembly of citizens of any particular state. End of note. The new covenant and its mediator, the shed blood of Christ crying for pardon and peace. It was the purpose of God nevertheless to bless the earth. He could not do so according to man's responsibility. His people even were but as grass. He would, therefore, establish a new covenant with Israel, a covenant of pardon, and according to which he would write the law in the hearts of his people. The mediator of this covenant had already appeared and had done all that was required for its establishment. The saints among the Hebrews have come to the mediator of the new covenant, blessing was thus prepared for the earth and secured to it. Finally, the blood of Christ had been shed on earth, like that of Abel by Cain, but, instead of crying from the earth for vengeance, so that Cain became a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, a striking type of the Jew, guilty of the death of Christ, it is grace that speaks, and the shed blood cries to obtain pardon and peace for those who shed it. The present condition before earthly blessing comes, the shaking of all things announced, Christ's kingdom immovable, the character of our God, consequent fitting service. It will be observed that, although speaking of the different parts of millennial blessing, With its foundations, all is given according to the present condition of things, before the coming of that time of blessing from God. We are in it as to our relationships, but the spirits of the just men of the Old Testament only are here spoken of, and only the mediator of this new covenant. The covenant itself is not established. The blood cries, but the answer in earthly blessing has not yet come. This is easily understood. It is exactly according to the existing state of things and even throws considerable light on the position of the Hebrew Christians and on the doctrine of the epistle. The important thing for them was, that they should not turn away from him who spoke from heaven. It was with him they had to do. We have seen them connected with all that went before, with the Lord's testimony on earth, but in fact, they had to do at that time with the Lord himself as speaking from heaven. His voice then shook the earth, but now, speaking with the authority of grace and from heaven, he announced the dissolution of everything which the flesh could lean upon, or on which the creature could rest its hopes. All that could be shaken should be dissolved. How much more fatal to turn away from him that speaketh now, than from the commandments even of Sinai. This shaking of all things, whether here or in the analogous passage in 2 Peter, evidently goes beyond Judaism but has a particular application to it. Judaism was the system and the frame of the relationships of God with men on earth according to the principle of responsibility on their part. All this was of the first creation, but its springs were poisoned. Heaven, the seat of the enemy's power, perverted and corrupted. The heart of man on earth was corrupt and rebellious. God will shake and change all things. The result will be a new creation in which righteousness shall dwell. Meanwhile, the first fruits of this new creation were being formed, and in Christianity God was forming the heavenly part of the kingdom that cannot be moved, and Judaism, the center of the earthly system and of human responsibility, was passing away. The apostle, therefore, announces the shaking of all things, that everything which exists as the present creation shall be set aside. With regard to the present fact he says only, we receive a kingdom that cannot be moved, and calls us to serve God with true piety because our God is a consuming fire, not, as people say, God out of Christ, but our God. This is his character in holy majesty and in righteous judgment of evil.